But I want to look at first is for you to give us some examples of modern day systems and societal norms that we use today that were first established due to a civilization's initial relationship with water being so fundamental.
That, and if you ask me which institutions and which habits surround us today that have their origin in the relationship to water, I would tell you almost all of them. In fact, it's more a question not which ones, but at what point did each one of the institutions that surround us, whether it's laws, political systems, religious systems, at what point did the relationship with water provide a generative moment when we really shaped, right? The origin of the Constitution, and in fact, all of the federal regulations of the environment, which are steeped in commercial law. The Constitution, American Constitution, is basically a treaty on the rivers of the country, right? It emerges out of the Mount Vernon Compact that Washington agreed on the Potomac Canal, on what he hoped would be the Potomac Canal. And so, just to say, pretty much any institution that surrounds us today, you can bet has genetic material that comes from our relationship to water.
Can you share with us, when did our relationship as a society with water shift from water being this, we'll call it more sacred element, to being a pure commodity and us using and manipulating water?
But in the development of political institutions, the fact that we have to manage water in the landscape is a dominant shaper of the nature and form of those institutions. So those things kind of run in parallel. So you ask me, when does that separation happen? It never really happens. And in fact, even though we have this very practical and technical relationship with water through the 20th century, we conceive it as iconic, right? Even if not as religious, but as iconic, as sort of really deeply tied to identity. We only really lose that when we lose the land, when people move away from agriculture, which happens really after the Second World War. And suddenly everybody turns their back to the landscape and looks at their screen. And that, I would say, is when we really kind of lose the plot. And what's interesting about that is that that's changing again, right? We invested all this resource in transforming the landscape so that we could turn our back to it and just look at our screens. But a changing climate means a changing water world, and the water is cracking through the dams and the levees and showing itself at our doorstep, right? And so that's going to change again.
Has water ever been used as a currency?
Around that axis. The most famous example of this is in Odli in Switzerland, where there's a village called Turbel, which is a village in the Valais canton of Switzerland, where it's a small village, it's about 200 people, and there's a system of irrigation there that essentially distributes water through wooden canals. These are present in all of Switzerland, but in particular there are these wooden canals that bring water to each of the plots of land farmed by each individual. And there's an incredibly sophisticated schedule of distribution, so that each plot gets a certain amount of water when the sun's at a certain point in the sky. So back to your question, I mean, there are a lot of examples where people bartered and traded water. Typically, it's trading access. It's trading access to some existing or emergent infrastructure rather than trading the molecule itself.
Has there ever really been true wars fought over water throughout civilization's time?
The only water war that we know of is a war that's documented in the Stele of Vultures in the Louvre, which is a rock from about 2500 BCE that describes the war between Umma and Girsu, which were two city-states in the lower Euphrates basin. But we only have the point of view of Girsu, the winner. And the story claims that it was a fight over a plot of land along the levee of the Euphrates. And if that's true, then that is probably the first water war. But Aaron Wolf also concludes that was probably also the last one. So bottom line is, I don't think the water wars story is a credible explanation for the past, but there is a way in which the water security nexus is important, which is there is important evidence for water being an instrument of diplomacy.
Water. So I would just love to hear some examples of, say different civilizations in history, say Roman, Egyptian, ancient Chinese, and sort of a little bit of their history and maybe some of the unique aspects that they've had with their relationship with water.
Well, this is a good opportune time to tell everybody to read my book so you can get the full story. So this is not exactly the democracy that we imagine today, but nonetheless, a distribution of power across society, as opposed to a power given from on high from some divine right? And how did this happen? That happens because the economy of Athens in the 5th and 4th century was an agricultural economy, a very productive one. And the defense of Athens was done by the hoplites, heavily armored infantrymen who were the defenders. If you read the Peloponnesian Wars or the Persian invasion that Herodotus talk about, the Greek cities, and particularly Athens, is always defended by the phalanx. Now, the hoplites that made up the phalanx were farmers, and they could afford those heavy weapons because they were wealthy farmers. And because they were the defenders of the polis, they demanded political agency. And that's the reason we had those reforms that then gave us the DNA of democracy. They were wealthy because of the distribution of rainfall on Attica, which is the region where Athens is. And in fact, you can go back and reconstruct where different political parties lived in the region and discover that rainfall maps onto the distribution of power. Right, so that's an example of where the distribution of water ended up having a profound impact on the distribution of power.
We have other much more complicated issues today of not just getting the water, but what is the water that we are getting?
Those situations when you have a densely packed population, you inevitably have issues with waterborne diseases. And so that's been the primary kind of pollution issue for a long time, until you get to the second industrial revolution, where you start having issues with chemical processing and dyes, and then Tom's River comes up and all these kind of other kind of tragic stories of impact. Italy had a scare in the 80s with dioxin, with a particular pollutant out of a chemical factory. And ever since then, and to this day, Italy is the second largest market for bottled water as a result of that. Countries that are still industrializing are going through this problem of having to industrialize, having all that knowledge, but not maybe being able to manage it, right? And that's where I think there's a responsibility of the developed world to help. And alas, we don't have a great track record of that.
One, do you think things like water footprints, which are really devised to look at the hidden water, the embedded water, and all the products and services that we indulge in, will eventually have any major impact in looking at water?
So now you go to the virtual water picture, and what are you carrying then? What value are you carrying in the virtual picture? Well, it depends on where it came from. Right? Because, you might be carrying water in coffee that was essentially rain-fed in the Amari region of Ethiopia. That water came for free, and it will continue to come for free. It's not, there's no kind of economic kind of content in the fact that there's a lot of water in that coffee. But if the coffee came from some place where, and I'm not talking about other environmental impacts at this moment, but coffee is mostly not irrigated, but suppose you were to irrigate coffee, then that irrigated coffee would be carrying water that had a very different value from the rain-fed coffee. And so one of the challenges of the virtual water story is that whilst it reveals these connections between countries, it actually has no content about the economics.
Giulio, you cease to amaze me, and I think us, with your vast knowledge and understanding of water in so many dimensions and so many perspectives. Thank you. We're so grateful for you and for the work and research you've done, and for sharing this wisdom that you have, and look forward to your next book.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, Stuart. So thank you to you and Peter and Didier for organizing, and thank you to all for listening.